Hello, my name is Jess Wilson. So I'm giving a guest presentation tonight. I am a design planner with the City of Lowell Department of Planning and Development. My role specifically focuses on parks and public space renovations throughout the city. So this is kind of a graphic of our whole structure. So I'm part of the project management team. We do brownfield remediation, urban renewal, community engagement, and then parks and public space. So we're part of the overall Department of Planning and Development, which also has all these other aspects to it, like housing and transportation, economic development, community development, development services. I've included sustainability kind of dashed in because they're technically part of DPW. This is a new department, but they are housed in our office and we collaborate very closely with them. And then all of us report directly to the City Council, the mayor, the city manager. So in Lowell, we're known as a weak mayor form of government, which means our city manager is essentially the most authoritative person in the city who has the power to sign things and make the important decisions. But really, all of us report to the citizens of Lowell, and we are all public servants who are in our professional capacity here to support the greater public good. And then I also teach at the university. I see some familiar faces in here from my class this semester and last semester. So this semester I'm teaching landscape architecture for climate resilience, and in the fall I teach urban design for environmental justice. So I'm here tonight to talk about how our city of Lowell is impacted by climate change and some of the things that we're doing locally to address this. So when we hear about climate change in the news and media, often we're seeing things about sea level rise. The wildfires have been a big one, hurricanes and extreme storms. And obviously we're not affected by sea level rise. We're not a coastal community. We're pretty well protected from wildfires, especially being such an urban area. But we are heavily impacted by inland flooding, as well as extreme heat events that can cause heat-associated illnesses and rapidly deteriorating infrastructure. A couple of years ago, if you were in the city, you might have seen in the news there was a major water main break right across the river on Merrimack Street. This displaced hundreds of residents, primarily senior residents living in a Lowell Housing Authority building. They were displaced for several months, living out of hotels with no kitchens. Their pets had to go live in shelters. It was a really challenging time, and that water main break is the direct result of climate change and increased freeze and thaw cycles that are more rapidly deteriorating our infrastructure. And then, of course, we've also experienced severe storms like Snowmageddon in 2015 and the Mother's Day flood of 2006. We're seeing biodiversity loss. This is a night heron, which I've actually seen at the Francis Gate Heritage State Park over on Broadway Street by Colburn Home. And then there are public health threats. We all just lived through and are living through a global pandemic. This is something else that is caused by impacts of climate change. So, show of hands if you've seen a diagram like this at some point in your education. Yes, so we've all seen the water cycle diagram. It rains, it infiltrates into the ground, it replenishes the groundwater flows into streams, which flow into lakes and oceans. This evaporates, it transpirates, it becomes condensation, it rains again, and the cycle continues. And you can kind of see that process a little bit in this photo of our local state forest. You can kind of see the mist rising off the lake, the dense vegetation around it. Nature is at work. But in urban environments, this process is severely disrupted. So no longer can the rain just sink straight into the ground. Most of the time, like at Cross Point Towers in Lowell, it's hitting the paved surface, can't infiltrate, so it's however that surface is graded, wherever it's sloping to, that's where the water is going to run, become channelized, most likely enter a gutter or a drain or some kind of underground pipe system that then is going to rapidly charge our rivers and streams, which is why we see that flooding all of a sudden, because instead of it all naturally sinking slowly into the groundwater, it's all getting funneled into the same place, entering at the same point all at once, and it's a much faster process. So our conventional way of dealing with this is through hard or gray infrastructure. So this is primarily invisible underground vast systems of pipes that convey all that water, and often are combining it with raw sewage water. And I'll talk a little bit more about combined sewer systems in a minute. But we're learning more and more about the benefits to taking a soft or green infrastructure approach to managing stormwater. Instead of hiding it underground, we can learn from ecological processes and systems to make those processes visible, make that water visible, educate people about where the water comes from, where it goes, how this all works, and why it's important. And all of this can be more cost-effective and have some of the same impacts of doing a gray infrastructure project. So combined sewer overflow systems, that is what most of the city of Lowell still has to this day. When the EPA was founded in 1970, a couple years later, they established the Clean Water Act. This was an act mandating that all municipalities throughout the country needed to separate their sewer systems from their stormwater systems, because what happens in a combined sewer overflow system is that when we get a heavy rain event, this pipe that conveys the water overflows, and when it overflows, it goes to an outfall directly into the rivers and the streams and our water bodies. So this is, again, combined stormwater and like raw sewage water that's not getting treated and just getting dumped into the rivers. That's why when it rains, you will see warnings and flags telling you not to swim, because there is an elevation of bacteria that results from that overflow. But when you separate the two systems, now you've got the sewage water getting piped to the wastewater treatment facility, in this case Duck Island in Lowell. So if you were to follow around the river towards Drake-it, you'll get to Duck Island. You'll know you're there because it smells very bad. And then the stormwater will still most likely be conveyed into the waterways, but at least it doesn't have raw sewage in it. It's still picking up some toxins because there's oil in the roads, there's fertilizers in the grass that it's running through, there's garbage and other harmful things. So that's where green infrastructure can really come in to help filter and clean that water before it enters our waterways. So a little bit about the project and how it got started. I always like to start with this because this was a student-generated project in the beginning. There was a group of Harvard students in their Master of Urban Planning program who, for several years, worked in the city of Lowell creating neighborhood plans, and their last year they did a neighborhood plan for Centerville. And students broke into smaller groups, and they did kind of smaller group projects looking at specific recommendations within that plan. And one of those groups of students did a proposal for green infrastructure along West 6th Street in Centerville leading to the St. Louis Park, and really identified St. Louis Park as a prime opportunity for green infrastructure for a number of reasons. At the same time, we got a motion from Councilor Robinson, who represents the Centerville neighborhood, requesting that we explore the addition of a splash pad at McPherson Park. So I'll talk about this a little bit more in a minute, but we did a bit of analysis when looking at the splash pad location. And McPherson Park, which is also in the Centerville neighborhood, but it's a little bit farther up the hill towards Drake-it. It's right across from Gage Field, which is where the Robinson Middle School and the McAuliffe Elementary School are. It already has a public pool, and it's an older neighborhood with a fairly dense tree canopy, so it's pretty well shaded, and it would not be considered one of our severe urban heat islands in the city. St. Louis Park, however, is situated in a severe urban heat island. It's also an environmental justice neighborhood that meets the state criteria for minority, language isolation, and income. So it's a neighborhood that's considered most vulnerable to the risks of environmental injustices and impacts of climate change. We also looked at impervious surface, tree cover, flood zones, and stars all just kind of pointed to St. Louis Park as being a better location to locate cooling resources like a splash pad. So I'm very excited to share that we are now breaking ground on the splash pad in just a couple weeks. So that piece is moving forward. And this was due to a number of things that happened with funding over the past couple years. So in 2023, we got an earmark from the state. So that's similar to the city's capital funds, but at the state level, each state rep gets a certain chunk of the budget that they can allocate as they feel fit to serve their districts and their constituents. So we received a total $700,000 earmark, and this was for the basketball courts at St. Louis and at Father McGuire in Pawtucketville, which is right around the corner from here. So $350 for St. Louis, and then we also got a large allocation of American Rescue Plan Act funds. So this was the infrastructure bill that President Biden passed. The city got around $72 million overall. The interesting thing is right around the same time that well, I guess a little bit before that funding came in, so to give a little more history to our city council, there was a lawsuit in 2019, I believe, because formerly we only had 9 city councilors and they were all at large, meaning they all represented the entire city of Lowell. A group of citizens sued the city, saying that this was not representative of our community because the majority of those 9 at-large councilors all lived in the same neighborhood of Belvedere, which is the most high-income neighborhood in Lowell. They won the lawsuit, and we were mandated by the Supreme Court to move to an 11-council structure with 3 at-large councilors and 8 ward councilors that represent a specific district. So before this council structure changed, there were plans to invest about $13 million into Colley Stadium, which is the recreational facility that the high school uses in Belvedere, again in Belvedere, and put all $13 million into that one location. It does need a lot of work, and it is heavily used, so no denying that is an important project. But with having a new council structure with representatives of each neighborhood, they did not like the idea of putting all of the funding into one neighborhood. So they requested instead that we come up with $8 million projects in each neighborhood to do park transformations throughout the city. So that's how we ended up with the ARPA Neighborhood Improvement Plan. So St. Louis Phase 1 is one of the 8 projects that we're doing this summer as part of that. So we've already broken ground on some of these projects. Others are starting very soon. It has a very tight deadline for funding. We have to finish construction by the end of 2026. So we're really trying to get that moving. All right, then we applied for community development block grant funds to clean up Riverview Park. And that is a site, I'll show on the map in a minute, that's directly across from St. Louis Park. So the Community Development Block Grant funds are federal funds from the Department of Housing and Urban Development. They just had their staffing cut by, I've heard, 84%. So we don't know the status of that funding really. Right now, it should be safe, but it is federal funding, so it is something that is potentially at risk as we move forward. So last year we finished Phase 1 designs, and then we were lucky to secure another $1 million MVP action grant to do design and community engagement for Phase 2. And at the same time, we got a $5.5 million EPA cleanup grant, which, so the $500,000 that we got in CDBG funds to start cleaning up Riverview Park, we no longer needed that for the cleanup. We could use that for design. So the projects got combined into one kind of mega project to look at 12 acres of riverfront open space redevelopment. This year we will be constructing Phase 1 and kicking off very soon Phase 2 design and engagement. So what am I talking about? This is the master plan. This is St. Louis Park here. So Phase 1 that we're doing this summer involves the basketball courts, playground, and splash pad. And then this is the site right across this highway from it. This is BFW Highway. We're somewhere over here right now. Right now it's just an empty site. If you drive by it, it just looks like a vacant lot. It's contaminated. Don't go there. Don't touch the dirt. But we are starting remediation of that, which is very exciting. And so our vision is for it to essentially become an extension of St. Louis Park, and we're exploring the feasibility of connecting the two with some kind of pedestrian overpass or ideally a land bridge or something cool like that. So this is really a vision to transform St. Louis Park into a model of climate resilience. but also balancing it with the recreational needs of the neighborhood. We have several goals for this project, which are to enhance flood mitigation measures, improve stormwater management, combat urban heat island effect, engage and educate the community, improve physical and mental health in the community, and unlock future open space opportunities. So this map puts our project site in the context of the larger Merrimack River watershed. So here's St. Louis and Riverview. This is the Merrimack River. It goes around the bend here. We're hanging out over here in Olney home. This is the whole city of Lowell. So this is the Centerville neighborhood, just north of the river. Our site is right here at the top of it. This is known as Beaver Brook, where the river travels north towards Dracut. And then if you zoom way out, the Merrimack River watershed serves 600,000 people among 200 Massachusetts communities and sustains about 2.5 million people overall with drinking water. And of course it has an abundance of important cultural and recreational assets along the whole river. There's a lot of major cities along this river. You've got, I can't remember them all off the top of my head, but it ends here in Newburyport and goes all the way up to almost Woodstock, Vermont, I believe. And when we think about open spaces, it's important to think about them in terms of an open space network. They don't just exist in isolation, even though it may seem that way. And as we plan ahead, we want to identify potential green corridors and ways that we can improve pedestrian and multimodal access, street trees, to get to the parks. So in Centerville, we do have quite a few strong open space assets, but as you can see, St. Louis Park is in a little bit of a desert. It's kind of the only park within a 10-minute walk for the neighbors living in that immediate area. But if you go a little bit farther up the road, you have Hovey Park. So Hovey Park includes the city's first universally accessible playground that was built in 2021. We built 3 more of them last year, and we have I think 4 or 5 planned for this year. So we're really ramping up our accessible playgrounds, which is really exciting. This is the Centerville River Path that goes all the way from our Duck Island wastewater treatment facility here to our project sites at this end. This is McPherson Park, so this is where Councilor Robinson originally wanted to locate the splash pad. That's Gage Field, where the schools are. This is McDermott Reservoir, which is another interesting open space opportunity because it's a reservoir that's no longer in use and it's actually structurally unsound. It's got some cracks in it, and so there's a potential risk and liability to that neighborhood should the reservoir be reached. And so we had floated some ideas about turning it into an alternative open space. It is permanently protected as open space, so even though some city councilors suggested high-rise development, which caused great outcry from the community, that's not something we could legally ever do. It has to remain open space. The question is to whether it will remain an open water body. So the residents around that reservoir are particularly interested in seeing it stay water because, to them it's almost like having a waterfront property. It's a really beautiful asset for them to have in their front yards. So there's a possibility of maybe having a shallower water body, but we had also floated ideas for urban reforestation and pollinator meadow in place of that. I had, behind the scenes, worked on a much more active recreational approach that was just not going to fly, so that one didn't even go public. But we even had discussions at one point of can we use all the dirt that we're digging up from the sewer separation project and use that to fill in the reservoir. But that was going to be too complicated and slow down that project too much, so that didn't happen. And then we finally come back to the riverfront. We do have a temporary dog park here. It is the saddest dog park I've ever seen. I don't recommend bringing your dog there. It's better off driving to Chelmsford. But good news is we are starting design very soon for a new dog park in Back Central, close to downtown Lowell at South Common. So there's been a lot of look at activating this riverfront on the north bank of the Merrimack and Centerville. So when I first moved to Lowell about 4 years ago, I started volunteering with DIY Lowell and Lowell Litter Crew, a couple community-based organizations who did a community-led visioning study for the river path and its trailhead. So they were looking at the Gold Star Park trailhead, which is here off of Bridge Street, and then the Aiken Street trailhead right next to the Aiken Bridge and across from our sites. And then going all the way back to 2008, the Conway School of Landscape Design developed a whole proposal for the Riverview Front project. So we've been eyeing that site to be a park for decades now, and it's exciting to finally be making some progress on that. I'm going to take a sip because then I'm going to get into the history of the site, which is the most exciting part to me. So our project site has a really interesting history of environmental injustice. Going all the way back to 1870, when a large gravity main was run through parts of Pawtucketville and Centerville, and it just carried raw drinking water straight from the Merrimack River, and this led to a cholera outbreak in Lowell. In 1875, they started to finally understand what the source of contamination was and the reason for these outbreaks, and the pipe was abandoned, but it remains underground to this day. Anytime we do construction in these neighborhoods, we are often finding just abandoned pipe underground. In the 1930s, the Work Progress Administration, WPA, straightened and lowered the channel at Beaverbrook. That was that little piece that goes off north from the river. And they installed 2 dikes. In 1936, we had a major flood, and that's what this photo is from. You can see the water is all the way up to the top, the base of the Aiken Street Bridge. And these houses, their first floors were completely underwater, all the way up to the 2nd floor in some places. So in response to this, in the 40s, the Army Corps of Engineers built a flood levee. And so when I talked about the Centerville River path earlier and showed you that route from our project site to the Duck Island facility, that entire thing actually is the flood levee. So it's essentially a berm. If you were to walk on it, I'm on the path here, it slopes down to the river on one side of me, slopes up to the highway on the other, so it creates kind of this double layer plateau, and that's what creates the flood levee and protects the neighborhood behind it. The VFW highway was built by MassDOT in the 1950s. Now, MassDOT did not get the proper permits to do this, and it actually undermined these flood protections that were installed by ACO. All right, so then in 1972, we talked about how the Clean Water Act was passed into law, which required us to separate our sewer systems. In 82, the pump station at Beaver Brook was removed. 79 was the last major renovation of St. Louis Park. I found some old plans of it buried in our office. All right, 2005, Hurricane Katrina happens, and this is where my career starts to begin. So 5 years after Katrina in 2010, I traveled to New Orleans to help rebuild houses after the hurricane, and this was 5 years later, and there was still significant devastation and displacement of people who never moved back to the city. It was really eye-opening to see, but it was also inspiring to see the projects that had been rebuilt, the neighborhoods that were lifted onto stilts and implemented all these new solutions in the architecture to prepare for events like hurricanes. And it was the first time I started to see design as this way of finding solutions to ecological and social challenges. That's how I ended up deciding to study architecture, which led to landscape architecture, which led to urban planning, and here I am. So the importance of that, though, so in 2005, there was Hurricane Katrina. A year later here in Lowell, we had the Mother's Day flood, which is our last really major significant flood event, probably. So following Hurricane Katrina, there was an increase in federal inspections of flood infrastructure because obviously that was seen as a huge failure in terms of the government response to address that and how FEMA responded. And so they wanted to be prepared for the next storm event. And so they started inspecting flood infrastructure around the country. They came to Lowell and they said, "What the heck, you built a highway on our flood levee?" So this had the very unfortunate consequence of decertifying flood insurance for the residents in that neighborhood. FEMA is the body that determines flood maps that insurers use. Now, FEMA bases these maps only on historical data. They do not look at climate projections. So if you look at the difference between FEMA maps and NOAA maps, who do take into account those climate projections, they're very different. And so this means that often folks are going underinsured for the level of climate event that they are likely to actually experience. So the neighborhood around St. Louis Park, their insurance premiums skyrocketed, and they had to pay a lot of money. And as we talked about, this is a low-income, language isolation, minority population community. And this was obviously devastating. This was a huge environmental injustice that just happened recently because it took the city 10 years to fix the issues and get the levee recertified just in 2019. So this is the analysis I was talking about that we did to kind of determine what was the best location to implement cooling infrastructure, such as the splash pad and the green infrastructure components that we ended up adding to the project. We looked at impervious surface, tree cover, the FEMA flood zones, the urban heat islands, the severity, and the environmental justice areas. So this is some of the analysis that students and some of the students in this room worked on this semester. So they each studied a different component of the site and the forces that are acting on the site. This week they're giving case study presentations looking at other green infrastructure projects around the country and around the world that might be applicable to our project. And then their final assignment will be applying those solutions to our site. And this is my own little case study project that I did when I was putting together this early proposal. So this is the Gowanus Canal Sponge Park in Brooklyn, New York. And this small little kind of pocket park manages almost 2 million gallons of stormwater every year, which is pretty impressive. And so I liked the combination of kind of green infrastructure, but also creating access for people to get to the water's edge and integrate these kind of almost floating wetland aspects of the project. So this is a short video that will talk a little bit more about what sponge parks are and how they work. Let's see if we can get volume in here. All right, sounds like I can't get volume to work. That's all right. But anyway, China is essentially doing these sponge parks on a really massive scale, and they're calling them sponge cities. They're doing them all around the country. This is one by Turnscape. They're probably one of the leading landscape architecture firms working on sponge cities and sponge parks right now. But they're doing this kind of from scratch. They're using this sort of unclaimed land, building this on a massive, massive scale to serve entire cities. Here in the United States and cities like Lowell that are much, much older, much more densely built out, we don't really have opportunity unless we were to take over the whole state forest. We're not doing a project like this. So we have to really scale down and look at those smaller opportunities to kind of create more of a network of smaller scale green infrastructure within the city. These are the existing conditions of our site right now. So we've got the 3 basketball courts, 2 baseball fields, and a playground in the middle. This is kind of weird parking lot. This is Top Donut. So most people know this as the park behind Top Donut. Very few people know what I'm talking about when I say St. Louis Park. And then this is the whole Riverview site, which right now it's a little bit grassy here, and then the rest is kind of wooded and overgrown with vegetation. These are some photos of what we have in the park. So this is Beaver Brook, which you can actually kind of get down to the water's edge there, which is a really special moment because here in Lowell we know a lot of our canals have very hard edges, even our rivers. We have the river walks that you're kind of up high. There's very few opportunities to safely get down to the water's edge. Technically this isn't part of our city property, and it is part of the ACO flood levee system. So in this particular area, interestingly, they actually injected concrete into the soil to help stabilize the slope here. So this is an important piece of the infrastructure to them, and for that reason, they are very hesitant to let us plant any trees because they don't want roots interfering with the infrastructure underneath. Anything that would require a footing or going down into the soil, they don't want us to do that. But they are very supportive of this project so far, especially the educational opportunities that it presents for them to tell residents more of the story of like, what is the flood levy? Why is this thing here? What is it doing for you, and why is it important? So they want to be a part of this, and they seem open so far to exploring at least like a more formalized, accessible path with maybe some surface-mounted benches and things that don't require footing. I think there's some things that we could do to improve access to the brook in a safe way. So we'll have to collaborate very closely with ACO on that. So this is what we're doing for phase 1. This is our playground design, which I'm very excited about. It's inspired by a heat map. So we've got these cool colors that also kind of mimic a river pattern on the ground, and then warm colors in the equipment to create this heat map effect. And then in between, this is the splash pad up here, and in between there's kind of a little pigment plaza connecting them. And so what you see here with the waves, that's a different concrete pigmentation to kind of continue that pattern of the river heat map into the whole space. And it's meant to be a nature playground, so there are boulders and logs and stumps integrated throughout. And we'll be doing some tree planting. We ran out of budget to buy plants, so might be looking for some plant donations. And this is our vision for phase 2. So this is what we got the grant to finalize design and do community engagement around. And it includes a lot of green infrastructure and nature-based solutions. So when I say green infrastructure and nature-based solutions, I'm using those kind of interchangeably. The folks at MVP like to use the term nature-based solutions, but they mean the same thing. So we are exploring the integration of bioretention ponds with a soft edge. So again, kind of creating that opportunity in the heart of an urban area like Lowell to access water, get up to the water's edge. What does that ecosystem feel like? Because that's such a unique experience growing up. I grew up not too far from here in Wayland, Massachusetts, but it was someplace that I had a lot more access to conservation land, and I lived near a pond, and just being in those environments on a daily basis, seeing the different animals and plants that would come to life in different seasons, and getting that kind of intimate connection to the land is something that is lacking for a lot of people who live in urban areas like this. And so when we can create those opportunities with green infrastructure, that's really exciting. And that's something we were able to do with the new splash pad and rain garden that we built at Armory Park last fall, where we installed a rain garden that's designed to mimic a riverbed in the heart of a city. So it has these stones and like these big boulders and logs that you can climb on, and just like create that various edge experience. So also looking at bioswales, which is similar to a bioretention pond, but kind of conveying the water towards the retention area, and using plants to infiltrate and clean the water as it goes. We're looking at urban reforestation, including a feasibility study for a municipal tree nursery so that we could potentially sustainably supply our own street trees and park trees, because as all the municipalities throughout the state are really ambitiously ramping up their planting goals for trees, which is great. It's a great thing. The nurseries are running out. There's a shortage of trees for all of us wanting to do all the planting that we're trying to do. So how can we kind of solve that problem for ourselves? We're looking at pollinator habitat, and then we're also looking at educational components like an outdoor classroom, multilingual educational signage, and climate-themed public art. And then looking ahead beyond phase 2, so this is probably many years out to phase 3, our thoughts are to address the parking lot. So I showed you it's kind of a funky configuration. If we dissolve that road that runs through it and we kind of straighten things out, we could actually fit a lot more parking in without expanding the parking area a lot. And we could implement permeable paving and solar panels and bioswales and really make it a green parking lot to make this, a regional destination where it's not just for Lowell residents, but people from other communities can come. They can spend the whole day, have the facilities that they need to stay comfortably, and then also considering what we want to do with Riverview Park and access to the Centerville River Path. There's nowhere to fit parking on that side of the river, so in that way, this parking lot will be able to serve really the whole open space network. And then also adding amenities like concessions, public restrooms, a larger picnic plaza and pavilion, bicycle storage, All of these things are the types of amenities that we would need to make this a place for families to stay comfortably for a whole day. All right, and then jumping across the highway to our vision for Riverview Park, we have a lot going on here. I would say this side of the project is a lot more conceptual at this point. This is kind of a newer piece that just recently got tacked on, whereas we've really fleshed out what we're thinking at St. Louis. I think it's a much more challenging site for one. We have much more complicated permitting because of it being waterfront, and then we have much more complicated ownership patterns and kind of coordination among different stakeholders on that site. But all the things that we want to explore include, that should say pocket beach, not concessions. Doing like we talked about, the kind of getting down to the water's edge and recreating that condition there, restoring the ecological function. Just like these, all the labels are wrong, ignore that. Extending nature-based play on this side, looking at terraced bioretention, looking at floating wetlands and a boardwalk. So this is the Wild Mile project. It was recently completed for $14 million with 10,000 volunteers in Chicago. I actually got to meet with the person behind this project who founded Urban Rivers this morning, and I learned a lot about what they're doing, and he's really excited about our project and wants to help in any way he can, which is very generous of him to offer, and excited to hopefully get him involved in what we're doing. Part of the one piece that we actually took forward from the 2008 student plan was the idea for an amphitheater. That's something that the neighborhood has frequently asked for in our community engagement. And then we're looking at floating wetlands. There's one, I think this might actually be it, actually in the Charles River in Boston. There's a floating wetland you might have seen. So we're looking to do something like that here because they help actually clean the river and could be a really cool way to help our green infrastructure efforts. And finally, how do we better connect these two sites? If you've ever tried to walk across VFW Highway, which I tried to do yesterday, it's pretty terrifying and it's not easy. I had to press 2 different lights and wait in the median, very high traffic area. And so if we really want this to be a proper extension of the park, ideally we're going to get some kind of pedestrian bridge, overpass, tunnel, land bridge. I don't know what it's going to look like. That's why we need to do a feasibility study and see what's actually possible. Our kind of multi-million-dollar mega dream would be a land bridge and just have the park be continuous down to the water. That would be ideal. Probably not possible. That would essentially require, call it a mini dig, and burying a portion of the VFW highway, similar to the Big Dig project in Boston where they buried the whole highway that went through the city and built a park system on top of it to reconnect those communities. Would love to do that here. Probably not going to happen. I think what is maybe possible is a pedestrian bridge. Worst case scenario, we're looking at some kind of raised painted crosswalks, flashing signals, better pedestrian crossing infrastructure there. And that would have to be working with MassDOT. So these are some examples of our vision for different types of bridges we might be able to achieve. And timeline. As you can see, this is a very long-term project, and it, of course, goes back even further, having started on this in 2021. But phase 1, we are going forward. We are starting in a couple weeks. That is going to build this year. We are targeting 2027 to build phase 2. So as I mentioned, we'll be doing design and community engagement starting very soon. We're just finalizing the contract with the consultants, and that will be going through essentially till June of next year. And then we'll be applying for additional grants, hopefully to fund construction. Phase 3, maybe 2030, gets a little bit muddier that far out. Riverview Park, pedestrian overpass, who knows? As I mentioned, it's a very complicated permitting and ownership situation, so that could be on quite a bit of a longer timeline. So we have a lot of community engagement planned for this project, including we are partnered with Lowell Parks and Conservation Trust. They are going to do our youth engagement. They're very good at that. They have a lot of school programs and educational programs that they're going to tie this project into and help us get the word out and do some education. I met with them yesterday on our site, and we did a site tour with them, and they brought the artist Kit Collins on board, as well as Loop Lab, which is a videographer company based in Cambridge. So they are going to be doing a youth-led art project with a video storytelling component. So I'm very excited about that piece of the project. With our consultant, we're going to be hiring, I believe, about 3 local community liaisons. So these are going to be folks from the community who are well trusted, who can help us get the word out, who are ideally multilingual and can help us reach different populations, and a whole kit of other things that we'll be planning and taking around the city in the next year and a half. And that concludes my presentation. Happy to take any questions. Yes?
So I know that earlier you talked about how Lowell, being an older city, has a lot of like infrastructure that is poorly mapped, and I was wondering how the effort's been for like actually mapping out this infrastructure. I know a lot of townships now have gone to getting their own set of equipment for ground penetrating radar, and that's just been a big thing, especially in the 500 megahertz range, because that's very effective at getting these old lead pipes. So I was wondering, like, is Lowell trying to like make an effort in getting their own if they don't have one and mapping this out? Because I feel like that would be like a very good thing to begin mapping out if they haven't already, just because of this infrastructure. I know when working in the food forest for UML in one of our labs, a lot of the pipes were there and we just did not know. So I didn't know how this is going to affect the project overall.
Yeah, we have, as far as I know, have made no efforts to comprehensively map our abandoned infrastructure. Just today I was out on a project site. We're building a new park downtown on Jackson Street, and it's a former site of a boiler house that served the mill complex there. And lo and behold, the contractor dug up the floor of the boiler house. It's just still there. This whole concrete slab was right under the dirt. So now we're having to assess what the extra cost of removing that is going to be. We also there were suspicions that there was going to be an abandoned water tank. We did not find that. So it's very much something we do as we go. We did do the ground penetrating radar, I believe, on Jackson Street, or at least there were discussions of doing it. But yeah, it's on a project by project basis. We've never tried to do it on a comprehensive.
Do you outsource that, or do you outsource it to a geophysics company?
It would be through like a consultant and the consultant sub-consultant probably. Yeah. Any other questions? Yes.
You mentioned the site was like contaminated. What the story about that is?
Yes, I can't speak to the specifics. I'm not an environmental planner, so I haven't been involved with the whole history of what was found there. But I know they did some initial testing, and I believe it had to do with when MassDOT was doing some work up there. They dug something up on our property, and it turned out to be some kind of contaminant, and it got flagged, and so now we're on the hook for addressing that. But we were really lucky to get that $5.5 million EPA grant. It's one of the biggest we've ever gotten for remediation. So I'm sorry I don't have more details on like specifically what was found and where it is, but there is a whole report that details that. Yeah.
Just curious, given that the past is no longer a good guide for the future of the changing climate, what is the city using in terms of flood projections?
That's a great question.
And how might that affect the plans?
So the MVP program, there's a whole it's a state agency basically, and they have climate scientists, they have regional coordinators. Of all the grants and state agencies I've applied to funding with, they are by far the most impressive in terms of like providing resources, being organized, having this all thought out, and they have a really extensive online resilience hub essentially, and they have their own, it's called the RMAT tool they have a certain way they want you to plug in the data on your park, the information about where it is, and it kind of spits out an assessment of what the risk is. And so it was determined to be a high risk for inland flooding and a high risk for urban heat island. So that's kind of how it got those points, I guess, in the MVP application process. We worked with the regional planning agency, NEMCOG, the Northern Middlesex Council of Governments, They have a sustainability planner there, and she was really helpful because I'm not someone who's super well versed in the climate data piece of things. I'm a designer and a planner, so I kind of oversee the bigger picture, long range stuff. But she was more familiar and was able to do that piece of it for me, filling out the tool and getting the outputs for the application. So I can send links to that afterwards. And I guess just one other thing I want to add is potentially as soon as tomorrow, I may not even be able to give a presentation like this anymore. So last month, I was given a list of about 100 words and told to avoid these words on federal grant applications going forward. Last week, I was given a heads up that tomorrow we're going to be pulled into a department-wide meeting and told that that is no longer just federal grant applications, that's going to be all written documents going forward. And I'm waiting.
The city is doing that?
Our department, at least, is doing that. And it's now almost 200 words from what I was looking up today. I obviously have a lot of questions about this. It's daunting. I was trying to go through some of our documents today just to see how many of the trigger words are in there. I found in our master plan parks and open space chapter, which is about 5 pages long, I found over 30 instances of trigger words
Who's
alone.
making that decision? That just seems like it is
I know.
not the right.
I believe it's all the way up to the city manager level that's decisions being made, and I'm going to learn more tomorrow. This has all just been kind of internal conversations, but I believe in transparency, and this is the reality of what's happening. We are facing like unprecedented censorship and attacks on funding, attacks on what's real and what the truth is about climate change. So I don't know what it means for this work going forward, and I don't say that to discourage anyone from going into that field. I think it's the opposite. Like, we need people doing this work now more than ever, and we need all the players. We need the scientists, we need the designers, we need the researchers, we need the policymakers. And we can't stop saying these words or talking about these issues.
The people, right?
Yeah.
I mean, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So it doesn't feel good. It's it's been my life's work over a decade that I've been working on environmental justice and climate resilience, and I came to Lowell to do environmental justice work because Lowell is the birthplace of the American Industrial Revolution. So in many ways, it's also the birthplace of environmental injustice. It really all started right here, and yeah, I moved here. I've come to love my neighbors. I love the city. I'm scared for what this means for the future, for the country, for the world. Yeah.
These trigger words that you're talking about, is this kind of relating to talking about climate change or environmental justice as a whole?
Yeah, so it's a vast range of words. To name a few of them, it includes climate resilience, environmental justice, DEI, obviously, but it also includes the words woman, female, disability. Yeah,
So
institutions.
3 of my grants were flagged, by the way.
Yeah.
By the same.
Yep.
We have developed a screening tool.
Yeah.
But we're not obeying here. We're so yeah.
Mm.
I don't know.
Yeah.
Maybe we should talk about.
I would love to know how the
something.
university is approaching it, because I haven't heard that much, and I think it would help the city make decisions of maybe how others were
And
responding.
I don't know if you feel comfortable sharing this, but if there are opportunities for those of us who work and live here to, I 100% agree that now more than ever, we need to remember what we stand for, and we need to be honest about science and reality and the truth. And we should be able to do that here in Massachusetts.
Yeah, and I'm also an AICP certified planner. I went through my code of ethics today that I'm beholden to, and I found 40 trigger words. So I don't know how I'm supposed to abide by this directive and also uphold the code of ethics that I've taken on. So, yeah. I wish I had more answers or better outlooks, but all I can really say is like we need more people on the front lines doing this. And if any of this interests you, as I mentioned, I'll be teaching again in the fall, hopefully. I mean, I teach, again, this is a public university, and I teach classes about environmental justice and climate resilience.
There's
so.
no reason from the university's perspective that you wouldn't be teaching. All
Yeah.
you need to teach is students enrolling in your course.
Yeah.
I just want, I want you all to hear that too, because that's really important. Like, these courses are gonna go forward, and UMass is not capitulating.
Yeah, that's good to
So,
hear. 'cause,
yeah, I think
for sure.
that's really clear.
Mhm.
And I also feel like, I mean, I just want to say, like, if you see an opportunity for those of us who live and work here to make our desire for reality,
Mhm.
for us to be honest about the physical reality of these things, to the city manager, I would ask that you let us know.
Yeah.
'Cause I would, I think it's
Yeah.
really important for our partnership with the city.
I agree.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's a challenging part of my job too, right? Is I'm a resident here, and I'm very political and passionate about these issues, and I participate in activism in my free time. But
You can't
by
do that.
day, I'm a professional who's like deeply enmeshed in local politics, and trying to keep those two things separate, especially lately, has been the lines getting blurry, and it's a hard thing to navigate. But yeah, if anything comes up that I think would be helpful, I will definitely let you know.
Yeah, and anything else that you have to share?
I think that's, we will be updating our open space and recreation plan this year. So as I mentioned, this is one of actually 11 projects overall that we're doing in parks this summer. So it's a great time to start thinking about what's next for our parks and open space. So we're doing a lot of community engagement. So I have a web, on the city's webpage, if you go to planning department and open space projects, I have lots of information about all the other great projects we're doing right now. And then if you go to the open space and recreation plan page, lots of info about ways to get involved with that update. We're going to be looking for volunteers to help us collect data on our parks, to help us prioritize the most critical improvements. So the open space and recreation plan is another thing that we're required to update every 7 years or so, and we need it to be eligible for state grants, which are going to be more important than ever with the federal funding cuts. So this is an opportunity for us to really hear from the community what the needs and desires are for the next pipeline of open space projects.
Okay, I want to be respectful of people's time and give you a round of applause,
Thank you.
but also